As of this writing, Joe Biden has been announced president-elect by the media sources. The remaining votes are still being counted. President Trump is readying to take additional measures to contest the election. And last night, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris delivered their acceptance speeches in the midst of a jubilant crowd in Delaware. And in his speech, Biden asked that Americans be willing to bridge the divide in our great country and give each other a chance. I would like to take a moment first, before I begin, to thank all the members of our community who volunteered to write letters and cards and texts and made calls to complete strangers to encourage them to vote. Because this country broke records in the numbers of eligible voters who exercised their rights. And they did so in the middle of a pandemic. And I want to thank you for your hard work, and to all of you who were determined to make your voices heard. But the desire to vote was not just in response to encouragement by a phone call from a stranger. It was also a declaration that there is something wrong, radically wrong, with our country. No matter how it ends, no matter what happens, half the country will feel like dancing in the streets, and half will be experiencing disappointment, despair, and even betrayal. So what do we do now? Many of Biden's supporters and Biden himself are calling for restoring unity. Whatever happens next, unity cannot flow from leadership in one direction. It has to be met with a commitment from the masses, from us. So I'm asking you this question this morning. What do you think we are and should be prepared to do ourselves? I'll tell you right off the bat, I don't have all the answers. That's the blessing of this faith and the freedom of this pulpit. I do not have to have all the answers. It is also, of course, a major bane of my existence personally and for this calling. I know that a lot of what I have to say this morning is going to fall not on deaf ears, but it's going to fall on the ears of you who have your own experiences, your own grief, your own way of responding to the world, your beliefs about what is fair and just, your own God, or foundation of being that manifests justice and mercy, but rarely both. In other words, you're like me and not like me. It's what being human is all about. And my greatest hope this morning, and really for us, is that I will give you something to think about and a place to put your heart. So I want to tell you that right now, although unity may be a worthwhile dream, I think a rush to unity will be a mistake. If we want unity, then we have to be willing to work for it like we have never worked before. Just like we cannot rush the counting of votes, we cannot rush the journey toward wholeness. We need to go into this with our eyes and our hearts wide open. We cannot sacrifice justice for unity. And we cannot sacrifice mercy for unity. If we do that, as we did after the Civil War, we will bury injustice so deep into the body of the republic, of our society, and of our culture that we will never, ever have a hope of becoming the land that we dream of. In his 2016 article in the Atlantic Monthly, Eric Liu shared some history that we've forgotten. He writes, if there's one lesson to draw from the aftermath of the Civil War, the last time the United States was this polarized, it's that a rush to reunion can entrench injustice. Even at the peak of Reconstruction, as Northern Republicans tried to remake the polity of the South, rhetoric of reunion was used to unify whites across sectional lines against blacks, as well as Native Americans and Chinese and immigrants and other non-whites. Reunion, he says, meant paying homage to the nobility of the Confederate cause. It meant skipping past moral judgment and moving on to the common endeavor of Gilded Age money-making. It meant overlooking slavery by another name in the Jim Crow era, and wage slavery in the industrial North. It meant enshrining white supremacy. He wrote that in 2016. And I think if we had taken the time to embrace conflict rather than consensus as a tool for unification, as Liu argues, we might have worked through great differences. And we might have succeeded in enshrining the idea of equal citizenship in our national consciousness 150 years ago. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen then, and it didn't happen 4 years ago. The country was exhausted, as millions of us are exhausted today. It is deep and abiding grief and trauma and weariness that brought us to this point today. And I'm not talking about those who voted primarily for their pocketbooks or a breath of fresh air. I'm talking about the grief of being left behind as a throwaway people. I'm talking about the fear of having everything that we've worked for taken away. The conviction that those in power are willfully and maliciously ignorant of the realities of life for the rest of us. And the threat that authorities pose to our very lives, and the despair, the absolute despair that those others will never recognize our true moral superiority in rescuing the future of this country. This is not about politics, my friends. This is about using beliefs in right and wrong as weapons. Weapons used to defend the quality of life at the expense of others, and calling it just the natural order of things. If we are able to find any real and lasting joy in living in this diverse nation in the world, we are going to have to work hard for it. What are we? Should we be prepared to do? Well, I'm a minister and a progressive. So, of course, my suggestion for you all this morning is to take things slowly. Whatever we do, to do it step by thoughtful step. First, even though it may be very hard, maybe the hardest thing that we have done as a people, we have to listen. To do this work, we need to understand why people voted the way that they did. We have to understand why the reasons that so many were eager to inflict pain, to ignore the threat they posed and continue to pose to millions of Americans. Lou also made another point about our history 4 years ago. He talked about the fact that there are no clean breaks in recent American history between good and evil. No single line of culpability that leads to a single large group of living Americans being called perpetrators. This is true of the legacy of African American enslavement. It is also true of all the power imbalances that are now creating tectonic pressures in our politics. The squeezing of local labor by global capital, the formation of a meritocratic elite detached from everyday Americans, the rigging of public policy to benefit that elite, the depopulation of the middle class, the relative decline of whites, and the rise of the rest. We have, up until recently, tolerated, and with that toleration, perpetuated violence on marginalized groups. And we have failed to fulfill our promises as a nation of basic safety and equal opportunity. We cannot ignore this pain as we move forward. And it's why I'm asking that we take things slow. Not only do we need to listen, but we have to face ourselves. Facing history. A lot of people are familiar with that curriculum. And part of that work, and part of what we need to do this work, is to not deny our wounds. I am a minister. But I have to tell you, I cannot speak to you of radical forgiveness. I can't do that. There is a history that we need to face, our own, and others who do not see the world as we do. All of us need to face that history. Leaping to forgiveness is, and what Tonya Russell of NBC News calls toxic positivity, does harm to all of us, but primarily to victims, by smoothing over in the name of peace the violence that they have experienced. I am a minister, and I do believe more in radical self-reflection and reckoning. And while we're at it, messy conflicts that get to the truth of things. I believe in those things more than I believe in harmony. You see, we need to know what we believe, and we need to know what our neighbors believe, and we need to know what is the truth as best we can. We need to take responsibility for the impact of our own actions and our inaction, and those of generations before us from whom we descended. And above all, unity cannot be at the expense of remembering who and what we have forgotten in our great march forward. So our leaders now are talking about building bridges across divides to reach our neighbors. And I say the heck with bridges. We need to cross the divide without a bridge, step by step, slogging through the flood, getting cold and wet in the raging water. Even more, we need to meet one another in the middle. And we need to keep walking to the other side, following their path home. And when we get to their home, where their hearts live, when we get to the other side, we have to turn around and we have to look at that flood. We have to look at that river, that raging water, before we climb down the high horse of our convictions. We have to look at that water and try and see how we got ourselves into that mess. Because the truth for all of us is that we cannot continue the way we have done socially, economically, ecologically. We can't continue this way. There comes a point of no return. There comes a point of no return, whether it's a pandemic or climate emergency or a culture or a religion. There comes a point of no return in all of these things. There comes a point where we will not survive. There comes a point when we have to make sacrifices. We have to make sacrifices of our comfort, of our belief in the right way of doing things, in our conviction that what we do is for our own good and not the good of others. We have to make sacrifices so that others may survive. And I ask you to believe that in your gut, and believe it in your spirit, and believe it in your heart. And with any luck and love, I will see you on the other side. Thank you.